Good afternoon and welcome back. We had a short break there and we're now going into the second half of our afternoon session. And the first speaker we have is Dr. Jim McAdam, very well known for his work on agroforestry. He's going to do a presentation with us now, and then we will have a questions and answer session, and he might talk a bit about his pioneering work at the Loughgall forestry site. So take it away, Jim, and welcome from everybody from us to the event today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And it's great to be back again. I think this is the third BioFarm I've spoken at, so Sean's getting fed up with the sight of me, I know. But the first two really I spoke about, I did concentrate on sort of the findings from the agroforestry research we've done at Loughgall and how agroforestry could fit into farming systems. Today I'm going to concentrate a bit more on soil health, because soil has been really the focus of yesterday and today's presentations, and how agroforestry can lead to benefits in terms of soil, particularly in terms of soil health, but look also at the wider options there are for agroforestry. So I'm going to really just cover what do we mean by agroforestry and soil health, and then a wee bit about soils, just soils generally, just to chip in. I know we've heard from really experts yesterday in the US and Australia and so on, but I'll just talk a wee bit more about in the Irish context about soils, what we mean by them, and then what benefits can agroforestry bring to soil, and sort of finish up with looking at some of the options for agroforestry and how it might fit into farming systems here. What do we mean by agroforestry? Well, if we think of the challenges we're facing in the sort of land use sector, the big challenge really is how we can reduce the environmental footprint of farming systems without compromising food production or productivity, and to achieve climate resilience for food production at the end of the day. And that's really what we're all about. And agroforestry is just one potential tool in our armoury to meet that challenge. I don't like the word agroforestry, I make that clear, because it's not a forestry system as such. It's a way to integrate trees into the farming system where we can maximise and diverse the outputs from those trees and help them to contribute to the overall farm sustainability, which is not what a lot of people understand by forestry, which is, if you like, a blanket covering of trees for particular purposes, which of course we need as well. So getting another word is difficult. It's not tree farming, it's maybe trees on pasture, and there's other ways you can integrate trees into farming systems as well. So we're stuck with the word really, because that's what's accepted in EU parlance and so on, the word agroforestry. What we really mean by agroforestry systems are ones where trees are combined with crops and or animals on the same unit of land. That's the critical thing. And you could have a farm and you could have a block of trees on one side of it, or a row of trees around the whole farm. That's not, and you would also have your farmland. That's not agroforestry. Agroforestry is where they're both integrated closely with each other, so that you're getting the range of ecosystem services and the sort of significant ecological benefits that those trees being integrated into the farmland can bring. Just to illustrate it sort of way, it goes back to the basic biological concept that systems which are more complex ecologically, if you like, they've got a more complex range of food webs and plants and animals within them, those tend to be more stable, and therefore they're going to be more resilient to climate change, more resilient to changes we have to make in management to adapt for nutrient costs or whatever. So when you introduce trees into a farming system of some way or another, you bring in a whole range of ecological diversity, which makes that a much more stable system. And just the diagram just shows some of those complex interactions that are going on, and that's the sort of things we're going to talk about this afternoon. What is the evidence we have for those? How are they operating? How do they operate in this country? And just to show like that integrating trees into our farming profile, not as a block of trees as a forestry, but into certain situations in farms, can help give us that ecological diversity and stability. That's just the sort of thing I'm talking about. That's the Loughgall silvopastoral site, which is that's just 2 years ago. Still doing very, very well, where you're integrating trees into a grassland system grazing with sheep in that instance. That's just to give an overall feel what we mean by an agroforestry system. It's essentially, in my view, I'm not a forester. I come from a grassland background, a grassland scientist, and I really just see trees being put into that grassland to make it more sustainable and to help look at improve the soil and the soil health within that. Ecosystem services is a sort of fashionable word that we've been using. It really just means what do we get from nature, the things we get naturally, if you like, from any system of land. And if you think of that previous picture I showed, and if you break it down to look at what are the outputs we're getting from that, you compare that just to an ordinary livestock grazing on a grass field, you get a limited range of outputs and deliverables. But as I said, if you have trees in that, you immediately increase the range of outputs that you get there. You can see you have renewable energy, pollinators, biodiversity, timber, crops, meat, animal welfare, all the wool, all those sorts of things that you're getting from a system like that, which are the sort of things that we need looking forward in the type of farming systems we have. But I'm going to concentrate today on those that I've marked in the bottom there, just our carbon storage, our healthy soil, and flood control, and the way that the changes in soil structure that trees can bring can help to control the porosity and the movement of water through that soil, which we heard a good bit about yesterday. Soil. There's three things we need for life on Earth, and that's water, sunshine, and soil. First two we can't do much about. We take what we get. With soil, we can manage it. We can destroy it, as we've done in a lot of cases, or we can build it and we can make it more fertile to deliver what we need. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about soil, a bit about soil in Ireland, and a bit about soil carbon. It's stored, released, and sequestered, and how that all contributes to soil health and soil management. And then when we add trees into that system, how does that, if you like, benefit our soils and make them more healthy and more manageable? Well, as I'm really going over, probably teaching you all to suck eggs, but if you think of some of the theory we had yesterday, every soil is really composed of two main components, three if you like, a mineral and a chemical part. That sort of gives the soil its skeleton, if you like, holds the bits together. And then what is more important, or what is obviously extremely important, is the organic part of that soil, or the living part of the soil, which gives it some very particular attributes. And the soil properties that we have are largely a function of the rock, the bedrock they come from. And this is what I try to stress to people, that there's a huge diversity of soils out there, and it's very important that we recognize that we have different soils and different soil types. And we can't do much about those because most of them come from the geology of the rocks below them. And they will determine its chemical composition and its nutrient capacity and its fertility and so on. In fact, Ireland has a really remarkable variety of soil types, and which reflects really our geological history, where we've come from, all parts of the world pushed together. I don't know the exact details from the south of Ireland, but from Northern Ireland, where I come from, the Northern Ireland Soil Survey identified, which was carried out in the 1990s, and now still is a very extremely valuable tool we have in managing our soils and managing our lands to store and manage carbon, if you like. The Northern Ireland Soil Survey identified 308 different soil types. That would be, might be a few more if you added in, if you include the south, but it wouldn't be that different. Whereas, using exactly the same methodology, the England and Wales Soil Survey, which we were a part of, found only about twice as many soil types in 11 times the area. So that gives you an idea just of how varied and diverse our soils are. We have 29 soil maps that cover Northern Ireland, and there's just one, an area on the north coast, the Giant's Causeway is up in the top corner. It's the entrance to Lough Foyle. And you can just see the diversity of, those are all different soil types. Every one of them storing different nutrients, having the capacity to store carbon and sequester carbon in different ways. Therefore, we have to recognize there's that difference in what we can do and how we can manage those soils. So when I'm out in my current position, and so with Ulster Wildlife, for example, or just out doing farm surveys and doing carbon counts on those farms and how we manage and store our carbon. The first thing I get the farmer to do is look at the soil map and say that there's, for example, there's a field in County Tyrone there where if you look at there's 2 or 3 different soil types alone in that particular piece of land. So when you know that detail, then how you manage that soil with that knowledge and information helps very much on how you can store carbon, sequester carbon, and the type of plants and trees and so on that you can grow on it. So we think about soil health and sustainability. A healthy, fertile soil is a dynamic living system, and we saw all the detail yesterday of the number of millions of this and millions and trillions of that's in soil. I won't go into all that detail because that's all known, and we know that soil is a living, dynamic entity, and that's what's the important thing about it. It's not an inert substance that you can just let sit there and, or compress or destroy or whatever. And it's got physical, chemical, and biological properties that promote plant and animal health and maintain its environmental quality. And soil health is really what we're talking about. It's the ability of a soil to sustain in the long term its most important functions. In other words, we talk a lot about degraded soil and soil degradation. That's the complete antithesis to soil health. Soil health is about sustaining a soil to deliver the important functions of plant, animal growth, and eventually food production and human health. It underpins crop and livestock health and productivity, and as we've seen and now know a lot more about, and there's a lot more to find out about the food we eat, which comes from the soil. So the health of our soil reflects the health of our diets. Protecting soil health is very critical to environmental sustainability because soils exchange gases such as CO2 and the nitrogen oxides with the atmosphere. They regulate the flow of water and rainfall in water cycles, as we heard about yesterday, and we're talking about the EPA report on the state and condition of our waters. A lot of that's because of the soil and the state and condition of our soil. They provide nutrients for plant growth. They break down organic matter and they alter chemical fertilizers. They transform and store organic materials as part of the terrestrial carbon cycle. And the soils will degrade contaminants applied through human activities or left by floods or aerial deposition, for instance. A healthy soil in the long term can sustain in the long term these important functions. So that's very important to us. How do we measure soil health? Well, the standard measure of soils, of course, is we look at the chemical analysis of the soil, and that has its value. But as we all know, it's not a true indicator of soil health. It just indicates one element of the soil health. We look at the pH, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and nitrogen contents. Then we can look at the soil organic carbon. Now we're getting a bit closer to what is an indicator of soil health. And for example, the FAO recommendation is that you measure your soil organic carbon about every 5 years because it would take that to significantly change it. And as most of you have seen, in Northern Ireland, we've just started this year on a soil nutrient health scheme where every farm in the country is going to have their soil tested over the next 4 years. And they're working clockwise around, starting with County Down in the east next year. And then over the next 4 years, every farm in Northern Ireland will have those nutrients measured on every field in the country. And also there'll be a LiDAR scan done of their trees and hedges to give their above ground carbon value. So we hope that within 5 years we'll have a total carbon count of all farms in the north, which is it's a move in the right direction. It's given us a good indicator. It'll give us an indicator at least of soil condition. I suspect the output of it, the first output will probably be that people will be encouraged to apply more lime to get the pH up. Because that helps store carbon in the soil and helps improve soil fertility. The other measure we have of soil health are physical properties. For example, the proportion of sands and clays and the infiltration capacity compaction, bulk density. A lot of those we've talked about yesterday and looked at in more detail. And then the whole concept of biological properties. How do we measure the biological health of our soil? Okay, the organic matter is very important because that's the dynamic living bit of the soil, if you like. We can use earthworms to measure soil health, and that's increasingly becoming recognised just as a fairly relatively cheap and simple way of indicating your soil health. And everybody, and Pat talked about the amount of worms he finds on his farm, and that is a really good indicator of soil health and whether your soil is actively working, but if the earthworms are working on it. And I'm going to talk a wee bit about those in the context of the trees and the agroforestry. We can go right to very, very detailed analyses using DNA sequencing to look at the range of microbes that are in the soil and so on. This is a fairly new technology. It's very expensive, and it's not one that we would regularly be able to go out and do in all fields. But it does give us an idea and overall how to look at soil health. And then soil has a whole range of life in it from all those things that we saw yesterday, really. And soil respiration, which is not too hard to measure, can be a measure of those organisms which consume oxygen and give out CO2. If we're managing for soil health, we need to consider the biological, the chemical, and the physical components of that soil. Well-maintained soils provide good structure, water retention, nutrient availability to crops, and they all interact to deliver those particular functions. And balanced soils reduce the requirements for any mechanical intervention if you've got that. From a farming or a land use perspective, managing for your biological component of the soil, really, you need to feed the soil regularly through the correct plants and organic inputs to keep the organic matter as high as possible. And diversify your plants in time and space. And we had an excellent from Richard's talk showing his multi-species swards. Really good to see the benefits and the interest and the uptake of multi-species swards has really been, over the last couple of years, has been a tremendous move forward to getting more healthily balanced soils. From a chemical perspective in managing our soils, then maintaining soils at optimum pH. Okay, there is some debate about the value of lime, and it's important to get the calcium, magnesium balance. But by and large, the research shows that if you, by increasing your pH to a more median level, you will improve the microbes and the living component of the soil, which will in turn improve the carbon sequestration and storage of that soil. And then, in terms of physical properties of soil, we can do some manipulation of those, but by and large, we're stuck with what we have. You can drain soils, you can minimize compaction and things like that to keep the soil physically healthy and manage it right. So the second part of the talk, really want to talk about the role of trees and hedges in improving soil structure and resilience, which is really, I think resilience is a key word we have to look at in moving forward with our farming and land use systems. We think of the value of hedges. As I said, in the Northern Ireland Soil Nutrient Survey, every farm is going to have a LiDAR scan. LiDAR is really just a type of radar that gives you a three-dimensional picture of what is above the ground on your farm. And that can then be related. There are formulas you can put in to convert the value for wood into a value of carbon, standing carbon. And we think it's very important that if farmers are given a value for the amount of carbon, that way you can actually encourage them or give them assistance in actually keeping that carbon stock there and increasing that carbon. Because you can't manage anything until you measure it, until you know. So we see that as being the value in having this sort of an overall picture. And obviously the more trees and hedges you have on your farm, the higher carbon count you're going to get. Even though over 10 times the amount of carbon is in the soil rather than in the plants above the ground. And we think about the value of mixed species, woodlands and shelter belts. All of those are bringing carbon into the farms, into the farm profile. The value of riparian planting trees and shrubs along our riverbanks and shucks. Very important for water quality, as we alluded to yesterday when we heard about the state of our waters. Trees could have a very vital role on the farm, integrated into the farm structure, not as forests or woodlands, but simply putting trees where water enters into the groundwater will enter into the water courses. It really helps to remove the nutrients from it. And then the sort of value of integrating trees maybe more closely into livestock and cropping systems. Agroforestry, if you like, but the others are also could be seen as a form of agroforestry as well. We're really aiming to change our land management from really the top to the bottom diagram there, and really the difference between those two dioramas just of a cartoon of a land profile are trees, if you like. If you look at the bottom one, there's a huge diversity of landscape and farmed landscapes which are caused by adding trees or hedges into that system. There's a lot of, in terms of soil health, there's a lot of evidence worldwide for the benefits agroforestry can bring to soil health. We know that with trees, there's a lot of research been done on the value of trees and where the root systems go and what they do below the ground. All that's pretty well known, so we can only assume that by adding planting trees into our farm systems in a range of combinations in scenarios, we can improve soil health by bringing that in. The soil's physical structure is very much improved by adding trees. Soils very much improve the porosity. Our trees very much improve the porosity of soils, the infiltration potential of soils, and we heard once again about that yesterday. Lets the water seep away, so the type of flash flooding we're getting, heavy rainfall events, which are what are going to be the norm now as we move into a climate challenge scenario. If you have trees there on the landscape, they can really help the water to get into the soil quickly and get absorbed into the soil profile and not just run off into the ditches and drains and carry nutrients and carry soil away. Organic matter and carbon in particular, carbon particulate matter, extremely important in our soils. Trees, obviously by their deeper rooting systems, help pull more carbon into the soil profile and spread it throughout the full width of the soil profile. Importance of mycorrhizal fungi associated with trees and associated with the understory crops that grow with those trees just leads us to a much more dynamic soil which has got a much longer lengths and greater density of those fungi that are associated with trees as well as with grasses and pasture components. And also in a type of agroforestry scenario where we have trees growing with pasture below them of whatever sort, by, for example, introducing multi-species swards, we can deliver much more nutritious carbon sequestering fodder at the end of the day. Come to earthworms. Earthworms really are a key biological indicator of soil health. And we know pretty well worldwide that earthworms are good, but if you're looking for evidence from the island of Ireland, just of sort of research evidence that we've had, particularly in an agroforestry scenario, there's really very little out there because we only have the Loch Gall site, which is 30 years running now in terms of testing the silvopastoral system and comparing them against grass-only systems. And if you look back, we established that site in 1989, 1990, and I look back at one of the first PhDs we had on the site was a girl, Lisa Whiteside. He looked at the fauna and the biological comparison between grassland plots and the silvopastoral plots. And the beauty of the Loch Gall site is we have fully replicated plots. We have 3 replicates of every treatment. We have full sort of scientific veracity by measuring all of the outputs and components and really getting a true picture of what's happening. And Lisa, in her PhD, looked at earthworms. She looked at species. She looked at diversity. She looked at biomass of earthworms. And the figure on the left is really just her figure from 1997, looking at the average biomass of young earthworms, if you like, in the plots. The left plots were just the grassland control plots. The right plots, the ash treatments it's called there, are the agroforestry. And you can see that there were more worms, significantly more, and that's just after 6 years after the trees were planted. The picture on the right just shows you really what the plots were like then in 1997, and you can see that there's significantly more worms in those. And the stripy bars are the bars where the grass was grazed, and we also fenced off some plots and just cut them for a year just to see if there was any difference between grazing and cutting. And you can see that there are more earthworms in the grazed plots than there are in the cut plots. So that was done a long time ago, and then very fortunately, recently, just after we were sort of forming the Irish Agroforestry Forum, because we were getting a lot of interest in agroforestry, and through spreading the word, if you like, we managed to pick up people who were across the country interested in agroforestry. And Rachel Connolly, who was studying sustainable agriculture at Dundalk Institute, came forward and approached us and said she was wanting to, she would like to use the Loughgall site to look at earthworms. So 2020, 20 years down the line practically, nearly 25 years down the line, we were able to have someone have another look at the earthworms there. She didn't go into the same depth as the previous PhD study, but she looked at how many, she did counts of earthworms per metre squared, and she used all the replicate plots, and she took random samples throughout both the silvopasture and the grass plots. And you can see that, and the top right picture is what the plots were pretty well like when she was taking her samples. And you can see that in the silvopasture we're getting significantly twice as many earthworms as there are just in the grass-only plots. So that was really good evidence that silvopasture was leading to that, was really picking up a very good soil health indicator in terms of earthworms. We were able to measure over time lots of other biodiversity features in the silvopasture. I won't go into them all, but the bottom line there are beetles. The middle bars are all the agroforestry plots. The left is the grassland, the right is woodland. And we were measuring more beetles, birds and spiders, but ground beetles are particularly good indicators of biodiversity as well, and you can see that we're significantly more in our silvopasture than in the other systems. Soils are our biggest store of carbon, and carbon capture is really the amount of carbon taken out of the atmosphere by the soil plant system. And how much carbon is stored in Irish soils? There's huge variation. We know, of course, that our peats are how really important our peatlands and our peat bogs are for storing carbon, but it depends very much on the vegetation and management. And remember, there's approximately 10 times more carbon in soils than vegetation alone, so it's very important that we concentrate on keeping that carbon stock in our soil. And if we think about the amount of carbon stored in our silvopasture, fortunately at Loughgall, when the trees were about 21 years old, we got some funding and we were able to excavate completely a number of trees, 8 or 10 or whatever it was. And we dug every root out of the ground and measured the amount of twigs, roots, leaves, every single part of the system. And we found that the total carbon in the woody biomass was about 77 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Now that had accumulated over 21 years, so that's an accumulation rate roughly of 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. And now that's not going to be even, obviously, because over the first years when the trees are small, they're not going to be accumulating, but it's probably profiled at about that level. And we looked at the amount of carbon in the soil below that silvopasture. When we did that measurements at first, we were dismayed to see really that there was as much carbon in the grassland as there was in the silvopasture and the woodland. So we weren't really sure what was going on there, because we were sure that having the trees there and the silvopasture would actually have given us, much higher carbon value. But in conjunction with our soil scientists at AFBI, we got to look at the form in which that carbon was being stored in the soil. And we looked at the size of the soil particles on which the carbon was bound, because that's very, very important. in how well fixed your carbon is going to be into the soil and how likely you are to lose soil carbon. And we found that on the very large soil particles, the top left there, most of the carbon was in the grasslands. Most of the carbon that was on the grassland plots was actually on large carbon, on large soil particles. And that carbon is very easily lost. It can be very quickly, depending on how you manage the grass, it can be very quickly oxidized because it's not bound tightly to the particles. Whereas if you get down to the very small soil particles, and you can see there, most of the, significantly more of the carbon is found in the silvopasture and in the woodland trees than in the grassland. And it's that carbon which is really recalcitrant. It's less likely to be lost to the atmosphere, and it's more tightly retained in the soil system. So that was good evidence for the benefits that silvopasture could bring, is that you're having your soil, your carbon bound tightly into the soil. So if we looked at comparing both of those, look at the from the Loughgall site, and say just the one site, but at least we know the whole history of the site, and it's a properly maintained scientific resource. We're able to, our sort of current calculation is that the silvopasture, that's the tree component of the silvopasture, are fixing about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And if you add that to the pasture, the ryegrass below, we haven't measured it on those sites, but the typical figures for a ryegrass pasture in Ireland are something in the order of 0.6 to 1 tons, depending on how it's managed and depending on species diversity, 0.6 to 1 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So if you add the two of those together, you could be getting up to 3 tons of carbon per hectare per year stored in silvopasture, which is getting you up to the level of a pure forestry plantation. Whereas we're still getting the farming benefits from the silvopasture, the meat and the output from that system. So the carbon picture is very good from the point of view of silvopasture. We have trees integrated to a farming system. We're storing carbon, the right sort of carbon, yet the farmer is still able to manage the land as active grassland and a food production system. If we think of resilience to extremes of weather, and that's really coming much with the focus of farming systems as we move ahead, we know what way the rainfall is expected to go. Silvopasture increases your soil permeability. It helps reduce compaction. We saw yesterday a lot about that. We found we were able to in Loughgall because, once again, we have a properly replicated trial there. We were able to measure infiltration potential using the instruments that Linda talked about yesterday, a soil penetrometer. And we found right down to 76 centimetres, nearly 3/4 of a metre below the ground, the soil was significantly more porous where you had trees than you didn't have trees. What that means in practice is really very significant. For it means, first of all, you get an extended grazing season. You can keep animals out on the pasture longer. And that is a huge benefit when we think of the problems of having to house animals, the effect on animal health, the effect on ammonia, which is one of our biggest problems we have to try and tackle when animals are housed. And the fact that we can utilize grass growth longer in the season. And we know that with climate change, the predictions are we are going to get extended grass growth period at both ends of the season. But if we can't utilize that because there's going to be rainfall, then we're not going to be able to get the benefit. So silvopastoral systems help us to get those benefits. And during the summer, you can help reduce your N2O emissions and just give us this resilience to flash flooding. So soils under silvopasture are more climate resilient. And during the really severe drought in 2018, the plots in the silvopasture at Loughgall were still fairly green, and the grass was still growing, even though it had stopped virtually in other places throughout the country. And I put this down to just a reduction in the evapotranspiration from the soil surface that brings. Well, if we just finish up and look at a few sort of the system options and opportunities there are for introducing silvopasture. I know we've talked about these at different previous biofarms. But trees can be incorporated into farms in a range of scenarios. Silvopasture is one, and there's just some examples. Hedges contain a lot of stored carbon and large amounts of sequester a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. Just some examples across the island of agroforestry systems, where we've the top left is a upland hill sheep farm and hill sheep and cattle, belted Galloways there in County Antrim, with sycamore trees. The cattle are stay out virtually all winter under the plots of trees there are there. And other examples of, you don't have to necessarily consider grazing all year round. It's possible to cut between the trees if you have it planted at the right configuration. Silvopasture is very suitable for poultry, so a silvo-arable system in the bottom left there, where we've planted rows of trees in a cereal crop. Once again, we did that at Loughgall, where we grew barley for 6 years between those rows of poplar, and then put it down to grass and convert it to a silvopastoral scene. Horses there on silvopast trees. Trees can be introduced into farming systems at a whole range, moving your thoughts completely away from the idea of block afforestation and farmland being two separate things. A couple of interesting people on this island are very innovative and thinking of ways to integrate trees into their farms. Elm trees with Shropshire sheep in County Cork, Eugene Kern's picture. A lot of examples of sheep-based systems, because it's easier to protect trees against sheep. Up there at the Mallers' farm near Cushendall in County Antrim, planted trees in pasture from scratch, protected with what they call cactus guards. These are a sort of spiky form of protection. And with Dexter cattle, they're doing really, really well in a very challenging environment, and they're really going to really improve the soil health on that organic upland farm in County Antrim. Trees lend themselves very well to poultry systems. Hens are a woodland bird, but by nature they like to have the shade and shelter of trees, and the trees absorb the ammonia that the hens produce, which is one of the problems for intensive poultry systems. Grazing orchards, if you like, is a form of silvopasture or agroforestry. In most orchards, a lot of the grass that grows beneath the trees is a nuisance. It's wasted, it's cut, whereas it has the potential to deliver a much healthier soil and a mixed system. Just the other day, I was thinking about introducing, we were thinking about how do we introduce trees into farms, and I went to see Fred Farrelly's farm in County Fermanagh. There he has been in the agroforestry scheme in the north for 5 years, and he's had all sorts of problems with tree protection and that, where individual spaced trees are protected, like in his top left. And he put a lot of thought into it and come up with his own ways about how to protect rows of trees using stretched electrified wire and keeping the animals off, minimizing the amount of materials that have to go into his tree protection, and really coming up with some good ideas on how to actually protect trees, first of all against sheep, and then by adding an outrigger to his post to protect them against cattle. We've got a lot more information now about the fodder value of trees, the benefits they bring to livestock in terms of health as a healthy food product, and also the fact that they reduce methane emissions from cattle and sheep by eating leaves and twigs. And this is part of a research project that's going on in County Derry, looking at feeding sort of abandoned willow biomass plantations, feeding them to cattle and measuring in detail the outputs you're getting. Very exciting results. And we're really talking about, once again, just to finish with that picture of regenerative farming, moving from the top scenario there to the bottom by introducing trees. So our conclusion really is that agroforestry certainly improves soil health. It gives increased climate resilience to farming and forestry systems. It lends itself very well to organic and low input systems. We all know that here. It can sequester rates of carbon which approach those of equivalent afforestation. And by integrating trees into farms and this range of spatial options, we can help deliver carbon neutral livestock systems, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve soil health, and carbon storage and so on, and all those are very positive, climate positive measures. What about support for agroforestry and people who are interested in it? Well, over a year ago we formed the Irish Agroforestry Forum, such was the interest of the few of us who were interested in agroforestry or worked or researched or advised in agroforestry, coming from both the forestry and the farming side of things. We were getting so many queries that we decided to form the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and that acts, and we did, and it's been successful. It's to act as a coordinated voice, and there's a very dispersed interest group across, if you like, the members of the forum, and that helped by sharing information, by sharing and networking and disseminating research, educating people in agroforestry, helping to train practitioners, which we think will come down the line now, advise policy, and just to generally promote agroforestry on farms. We have a good website going. We've been running, producing podcasts and webinars and so on. So have a look at the Irish Agroforestry Forum website for a lot of support and expert advice that's available. In fact, one of the last activities we're going to have in this year, we're going to run an autumn workshop on agroforestry. It's next week, next Friday. It's in Gertrude College, where we'll have a day of talks in the morning from practitioners and experts, and in the afternoon we're going to have workshops on silvoarable systems and on natural systems and on silvopastoral systems and so on. And we still have a few places left on that workshop. It's in Gertrude next Friday the 18th of November, from 10 to 3. And if anybody's interested, go onto the website or contact Maureen Kilgore, our projects officer, on Irish Agroforestry Forum at gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that stimulated some interest in you.
Thank you, Jim, and come and join us now. We'll have some questions for you. Really exciting work going on there, and I'm glad to see a forum bringing people together from, different aspects of forestry and farming, and you're obviously doing something next week in Gertrude, really exciting stuff. And the results, they speak for themselves really in terms of soil health, carbon sequestration, everything, the biodiversity, it's all a win. We'll jump straight into some of the questions. From Rhonda, listening in or watching, what's the best method to introduce trees, plant trees, if you like, into a farming system where no trees have existed on the land for years? For example, should one put in bare root saplings in winter or add any amendments when planting the saplings or trees?
Well, I think the first thing is decide what do you want to do with the trees, where do you want to put them on the farm, are they going to be planted, and look at your soil type first. Match your soil, match your site to your species. Choose a species that is growing well in that area and is adapted to that soil, and then plant them in a situation which fits in with your farming system, whether it's to reduce nutrient runoff, whether if you want to put it in your fields perhaps, make sure you put them in where you can continue to work the field with tractors or whatever, top the pasture, cut silage or whatever. And pick, yes, I would, sorry to finish with her.
Yeah, because she might have worked that out. I think what she's asking is, does she put in bare root saplings?
Yeah, I was just going to come to that.
Yeah.
I would definitely put in bare root, smallest trees as possible, and bare root. I mean, there's no point in spending a lot of money on a big tree with a root ball within a pot. Get as small a seedling as you can with bare roots, with approximately the same amount of root on your seedling as there is shoot. Okay. And plant that, and they will then take off the quickest and will be the most stable, and will, in 2 or 3 years, they'll be bigger even than the expensive tree that you would have bought in a.
Okay, that's a good tip. Also from Rhonda, same lady. Secondly, on our farm in Donegal, we've tested to see if we have worms in the upper horizons of our soil, and there are none. Will they come with time, or as the soil improves, or do they need to be introduced? I
think they'll come with time. We didn't introduce worms to any of our sites in Donegal, and the worms just came in. When the trees come, you get worms. Just simple
as there spreading manure, or would anything help that?
Yeah, I suppose farmyard manure would help that. Avoid to slurry applications at high, obviously. But once you get soil, there's no point in putting in worms unless you have the right habitat for them and the right food supports. And tree leaves, tree litter is the best stimulus for their growth.
Okay, Therese, what's the recommended tree spacing to allow the maximum grass growth? Is shading a detriment to it? That's what a lot of people would think.
Yeah, well, it's hard to know because the early research done on it shows that a density of about 400 trees per hectare. I mean, it could be 300, it could be 500, depend on the site, but about 400 is what the two support measures in Northern and Southern Ireland are based on, that density. That's theoretical, but those don't have to be regularly spaced. That is equivalent to a tree every 5 metres. But I would say you don't have to plant them in that spatial orientation. You could leave wider rows. 8 metres in a row and 3 metres between trees gives you the same, gives you 400 trees per hectare. And I would encourage that flexibility of planting, and whoever is designing schemes for silvopasture agroforestry, think of flexibility. You might want to contour plant the trees rather than straight rows up and down. A lot of farmers like the straight rows because it's just
they can get in with machinery.
Get in with machinery and stuff. So plant like that, and then thin those down. In Loughgall now we're down to about under 200 trees per hectare, because as the trees grow, of course, they will shade the sward, and when they start to significantly reduce sward growth, you have a decision to make. Do I take out some of those trees, let the light in, and the grass will pick up again? We removed, after about 12 years, we removed a quarter of the trees at Loughgall, and the grass growth picked up again. And we sold those trees. I mean, they were a valuable crop. In terms of the stumps... Yeah,
because that's relevant to exactly that point, isn't it? What do you do with them?
No, I wouldn't. We didn't touch them, and in about 2 or 3 years they'd rotted away completely. Because you have animals there, any regrowth from the stumps, they'll just nip it off, and the trees and the stumps are completely gone.
And your soil has improved dramatically.
Yeah, with that
completely improved
with
by
that
those roots
into
breaking
it.
down
Yeah,
in the soil.
yeah.
So no, and I would never see a silvopasture as a clear felling. To me, you're now into sort of a continuous cover, natural biological system where once you create openings in the trees, then interplant again. So you've got mixtures of trees, use mixtures of species, because we know how diseases can come in, and just have a continuous system, healthy biological system developing.
What does Jim, I suppose, suggest to protect the trees from deer? Yeah, there's a lot of different mechanisms. Which is the best?
Well,
you get the tubes and the
best that I've seen, but they're expensive, those cactus guards, which are the spiky guards. You can use them big enough, but they're expensive, but they're reusable. You could use them time and time again. And I would like to see, if there's going to be funding support for a system, that some of your trees you could at least put more money into protecting them, and other trees like willows, birch, which will coppice, and simply the growing of the tree to give the root system under the ground, even if it's nipped off, it'll sprout again.
It'll recover.
Yeah, but if you're valuable timber in that, like cherry or oak or something, yes, spend more money on tree protection than that. Our current systems of support don't allow that, because the department is very specific. Specifications for tree protection. I would hope that in the future they'll be more flexible and allow a more outcome-based driven.
Yeah, because some things might work with some species. We have a question there, don't we?
Yeah, Jim, an existing plantation, 25 years old, if you thinned it out, would it be suitable for agroforestry? Like, here's one you had in the oven earlier.
I think so, yeah. And one of the things I'd like to see is a lot of ash plantations are now obviously failing. And the recommendation is take them all out. I wouldn't. I would try people to thin those out and use that, if you like, as a kick-off for maybe a silvopastoral system. Remove the ash trees that are dead, or if you like, are worst affected, and then you'll start to get ground flora coming in. Get animals into that system, maybe pigs, horses, goats, Dexter cattle. Those will gradually and quite quickly improve the soil health. And then, some of the ash will survive, and then start to interplant with new trees, and just build your soil health up that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have we know that we've been, gentlemen in the middle table, we haven't heard from you? Yeah, you have the mic.
Hi. Thanks very much for the present. Do you know much about what type of trees would be suitable for planting on peatland to try and prevent the peat from drying out?
Well, the answer is don't plant any trees because trees will dry out peatland. So I mean the regulation is on blanket bog, peat over half a metre, it's illegal. You can't plant trees on. That's simply it's in the
Do you mean just kind of wetland or proper bogland?
It's not a bog, it's wetland.
Just wettish land.
Right, so it's not. Well, okay, that's a very important distinction.
Yeah,
if it's peatland, you can't plant trees, and you shouldn't, because trees dry out the land, and the aim is to keep peat wet, to keep the carbon stored in it. So,
but if it's
but
marginal,
if you
such a
have
rushy
marginal,
land,
rushy
you know.
land, yeah, willow, birch, alder, species like that will grow well in that, and that's the sort of land where drying out will help improve the soil, the soil health and fertility, and coupled with animals on that, you'll gradually build up a more biologically stable system.
Yeah. Okay.
Jim, that was a lovely, great presentation, and again, it's showing the benefits there at multiple levels of agroforestry. But the conundrum we have here is that we now have a new acre scheme, which has tree planting in riparian zones, tree planting here, there, but no really integrated approach to bringing this model forward. We now also today have increased levels of forestry grants for the regular forestry. And this all seems to be pulling against what we're trying to do. I mean, have you any suggestion of how we could maybe change that round, change that narrative? Is it a political issue that forestry and farming need to remain totally separate, which is part of the problem that we have? But really none of the current schemes are addressing the fundamental issue of how we integrate trees into farmland. And the second thing is, can you recommend trees that will